Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V-Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. I'm on vacation this week, so we are going to keep it a bit short. In just a moment, we'll be joined by beat writer Aaron McMann from MLive to discuss the Peach Bowl and much more. First, a few news and notes to get us rolling. Yes, even though I'm on vacation, the show is rolling on. The news never stops. Urban Meyer is out at Ohio State. Ryan Day is the new head man. What, if anything, changes in Columbus? Only time will tell. It's fairly quiet on the Michigan football front. In the coming weeks, we'll begin previewing the game with Florida. But right now, I think most of us are still trying to figure out what happened in that Ohio State game. My guest today thinks that what happened was a great game plan and Dwayne Haskins. Aaron McMann is up next here on the Michigan Man on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V-Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Here with us on our Game Day segment this week to talk about a lot of things. Even though the season is over, it's very, very busy on the football front. Aaron McMann from MLive. Great to have you back with us, Aaron.
Good to be back as always, Mike.
Well, as we began to prepare for taping this morning, it's Tuesday morning, and we all know the news is breaking that Urban Meyer is stepping down at Ohio State. The press conference is going to be Tuesday afternoon. Big news, maybe not unexpected though, Aaron.
No, it sounds like Urban Meyer is stepping down as Ohio State coach and retiring. And it's like we were talking about off camera before we started taping, but it's obviously been speculated now for a little bit. Urban's obviously been dealing with health issues and everything else, and he had those issues at the beginning of the season, off the field stuff. So it sounds like it wasn't necessarily a shock to everyone, but it is important. He's been a mainstay there at Ohio State for a long time now. He's won a lot of games. I think 82-9 he'll finish at Ohio State. He's obviously won several Big Ten titles, dominated Michigan. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. It sounds like Ryan Day, the offensive coordinator, is going to be the next head coach. Where that goes from here remains to be seen. Obviously Urban's done a very good job recruiting there. He's beat Michigan most years. So I think this could be a potential game changer for Michigan to some degree. Folks have been joking now for the last week or so that maybe the only way Michigan beats Ohio State is if Urban Meyer retires. So, where this goes remains to be seen. Obviously Ohio State has a lot of momentum right now. So it's going to be up to Ryan Day to kind of continue to steer the ship. Well,
we shall see. As we said, we're taping it Tuesday morning, and that story is breaking, so there will be much more on that in the coming weeks and months. But on the Michigan football front, of course, we found out on Sunday it's off to the Peach Bowl, and I guess to say the fan base isn't too pumped up about the Peach Bowl is an understatement, isn't it, Aaron?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the players are too excited about it either. But it's a New Year's Six bowl game. It's the second now under Jim Harbaugh since the college football playoff era has kind of began. It is a big game. That's the thing I think folks need to realize. Michigan obviously didn't win a Big Ten title, didn't get into the Big Ten title game, so they didn't get a berth in the college football playoff. So they've got to settle for one of these games, and they ended up with the Peach Bowl. It really came down to the Peach Bowl and the Fiesta Bowl. Those are the two New Year's Six bowl games with at-large bids available. By default, Central Florida, the American Conference champion, had to go to the Fiesta Bowl, so that kind of limited the 3 spots available. And it was down in the Peach Bowl ended up taking Michigan. They're obviously going to play Florida December 29th. It's a noon game on a Saturday on ESPN. So you're not going to get all the glitz and glamour of the New Year's Day game. It's not obviously a playoff game, but it's an important game nonetheless. We spoke to the players this week. They've won 10 games. This will be an opportunity for the first 11-win season in Michigan football program since 2011. It'll be the first time under Jim Harbaugh. I went back and looked. Michigan's only had 11 win seasons 9 times in program history. So this would be monumental in that regard. It's certainly not what everyone wanted. You wanted a Big Ten title, you wanted to get in the playoff. But it is a big game, and I think that's something that folks need to realize.
Part of the malaise, so to speak, about the Peach Bowl is it's against Florida, and it does
Mm-hmm.
seem like we just played them, and we did last year. But last year was last year. This year, this is a pretty good football team, isn't it, Aaron?
Yeah, they're 9-3. Obviously, first year under head coach Dan Mullen. It's a very similar team to Michigan in some regard. And I was going through statistics, after the game was kind of announced on Sunday, and they're a very similar team just statistically. I mean, Florida's got an improved offense. Their defense especially the rush defense, is very good. So I think this could be it's going to be a challenge for Michigan. It's an SEC opponent. They haven't played an SEC team all season long. This will be an opportunity to kind of for them to redeem themselves in some regard. Obviously, their two most important games, biggest opponents this year, Notre Dame and Ohio State, they lost to. So I think if they can come out in this game and play competitively and even win the game, I think it'll kind of dampen some of the sour taste that were in the fans' mouths, the players' mouths after that loss to Ohio State a few weeks ago.
Well, as far as the Peach Bowl goes, we learned Rashawn Gary is going to sit out. Did that surprise you at all?
Not really. This is something Rashawn's been, and that's the thing folks need to realize. Rashawn's been injured all season long. He got hurt right before the season began. He played through it for the first handful of games of the year. He decided to come back because I know, a Big Ten championship and a berth in the playoff was a big deal to him and his teammates, and they didn't get there. So, for him, I don't blame him. He's a potential first-round draft pick in the NFL draft in April. He's got a lot of money riding on that. He's got his whole career to look forward to. So I don't blame him. It's become a thing in college football now where some of the first and second round picks decide to sit out, and I can't blame them. In a way, I spoke how important this game is, but at the end, it's not going to mean a whole lot either. It is another win. It looks good on the resume for the program and everything else. But after we saw what happened to Jake Butt a few years ago, and players that are rightfully worried, they're worried about getting injured or having something serious happen to them to dampen their potential NFL career. So I can't blame him. We spoke to his teammates, a handful of his teammates on Monday. They don't blame him either. And so I'd assume if many folks are in his position, they would probably do the same thing.
Do you think we're going to see any other players opt out?
It doesn't sound like it right now. Devin Bush should be the next choice here because he's also a potential first-round pick. He was asked about it last week on the Big Ten Network after he was named the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, and it sounded like he plans on playing. So it doesn't sound like it. There are a couple other guys that could potentially go to the NFL. Obviously, Lavert Hill, David Long, but those guys have played almost every game they've suited up for at Michigan. So right now it doesn't sound like it, but that doesn't mean it won't happen either. So guys have their own individual choices to make. They're getting their own kind of guidance from their families and potential agents and everything else. And obviously, they're speaking to the coaching staff too. So it doesn't sound like it right now, but keep an eye on it. We've got a few weeks now to find out.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time to talk about that and preview the Peach Bowl in the coming weeks. Until then, though, Aaron, there are other things to talk about, like Jim McElwain leaving to take over at CMU. I know you covered that presser. I wish he was staying. He's done a great job in just the 1 year he was here in Ann Arbor. But that's a great hire for CMU, isn't it?
I think it is. Central Michigan, they're coming off their worst season in program history. After 8-5 year, they went to 3 straight bowl appearances, and folks who aren't familiar with the CMU program historically, they've always been near the top of the Mid-American Conference. They had some very good teams in the late 2000s, early 2010s. They had that magical team with Dan Lefevre and Antonio Brown. A couple of NFL, Nick Bellore was on that team. A lot of NFL guys were on that team. So they're looking for a fresh face, and McElwain, obviously, as Michigan fans know, he has the head coaching pedigree. He's won plenty of games before. He's shown an ability to develop talent, as we saw this year with the wide receiving group. And I think that was maybe had one of the more underrated jobs this year. People forget that Michigan's receivers didn't really have a dedicated receivers coach last year. They brought McElwain, Jim Harbaugh brought McElwain on this year under a 1-year deal to kind of coach up some of the young guys, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Nico Collins. Not only did those two put together, I thought fabulous seasons, but he was able to, develop some of the younger guys. Ronnie Bell came in, I thought played very well this year. Oliver Martin, the redshirt freshman, came in and contributed. So between him and some of the graduate assistants, Ray Roundtree was on there. Ben McDaniels, who will end up being the wide receivers coach for the bowl game. All three were kind of involved in developing these guys, and I thought did a very good job.
I don't think anyone's surprised that McElwain is leaving to go anywhere, but you did see the progress that he made as a receivers coach. Another name, though, I should say stories I was seeing over the weekend were Pep Hamilton's name was popping up in regards to the Maryland opening. I don't know if any other rumors are out there, but do you think there's any substance to the fact that Pep might be going somewhere?
Yeah, I do. His name has come up before. He was his name came up a couple times last year. I can remember Mississippi State specifically for the job. He's obviously got he too has a long, coaching pedigree. He is the assistant head coach of Jim Harbaugh, and he's basically in charge of the offense to some degree and the play calling and everything else. So I would understand why a program would want to look at him, give him a look. He has, a lot of history and past with, developing quarterbacks and working with quarterbacks. So for an offensive-minded program that wants someone to come in and take control of an offense, I could totally see why he'd be up there. No update yet with regards to Maryland. I think he was one of 3 finalists that was going to be interviewed over the weekend. Haven't heard anything yet in terms of an update. But given his past and his coaching history, and he's obviously got Jim Harbaugh vouching for him, don't be surprised if his name comes up elsewhere for other jobs here during the offseason.
Michigan lost a few verbals since the Ohio State game. I don't think anyone is shocked by that, but have you heard anything about losing any other commits before the early signing period, Aaron?
Nothing yet. It's always weird this time of the year because you've got guys kind of making last-minute decisions. Like you mentioned, the early signing period's coming up. It's, I believe, December 19th to 21st. Mm-hmm. So kids will have 3 days to get, if they want to, ink, sign their their agreements going to school, they can. And I think I can remember last year, I want to say about half of the commitments did. So I would expect a similar number this year. But no, kids are still making the last minute decisions. I think some did see that Michigan-Ohio State game and the way Michigan lost and may have turned them off. But it didn't sound like, I don't think they're getting any more decommits at this point. There were obviously, Eric Gray's name had come up. He was one of those decommits last week. So you heard rumors. I think the guys that the guys that were thinking about it did. So I don't suspect any other guys will, but you never know. It's the recruiting game is always interesting because you've always got multiple teams, chasing kids, at all times of the year, whether they're committed or not. And at the end, you got to remember we're dealing with high school kids. Their minds change all the time. The reasons for committing to schools change all the time. So it's a funny game.
Just a minute or so ago, we talked about the fact that Rashawn is leaving and why, and possibly Devin Bush, maybe some others on the defensive side. Ben Bredesen had mentioned late last week or over the weekend he is leaning towards staying, so that would be great. The other player that folks talk about a lot, Michigan fans, is Shea Patterson. He, of course, still has that decision to make. Do you think he's ready for the NFL, Aaron?
That's a good question. I asked Pep Hamilton that, a couple of weeks ago. Last time we spoke to him, and he didn't really give an answer. It's such a good question because coming into the year, I think many folks are under the assumption that he was going to be a one-and-done guy. He's going to play 1 year and then go. But his name hasn't come up a ton when it comes to NFL draft talk. Mel Kiper Jr., ESPN's noted NFL draft expert, released his big board a few weeks back. Obviously, his first-round projections, he had Rashawn Gary and Devin Bush in the first round, but he also made a point of listing the top 10 guys at every position available, and he did the quarterbacks, and Shea Patterson's name was not on there. So that tells me at this point, I think Shea Patterson could be drafted, but he would probably be a day 2 or maybe even the day 3 pick. And if you're Shea, you've got to weigh, do you want to go mid to late in the NFL draft and, take your chances there or come back for another year and hopefully it improves your draft stock. The one thing that I think that would help Shea this year is folks seem to think that this is going to be the quarterback class is weak this year, so maybe it would help him in that regard. But, all signs point to I think him coming back. We spoke to a few players on Monday. They're under the assumption that most of the players on offense are coming back. So I think they included Shea in that. Now we haven't spoken to Shea since the Ohio State game, and I can remember asking him mid-November. He was asked about, he said he hadn't really thought about it. So We'll see. I do think he's NFL ready. If he'd go if he wanted to. I don't know if he would stick right away with a team. It would take him some time. The thing with him is he's short. He's not a bigger dude, but he is smart and he's got the fundamentals down. I think he could benefit probably for one more year.
No, I agree with that too. As you mentioned, Mel Kiper has Devin Bush as a first-round pick, and he has not made a decision yet, but I would think he's a goner.
I do too. Yeah, I think his stock has peaked. He had a very good year. He was named Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. His stats are good again. Opposing coaches were raved about him all season long, his speed and his hitting ability, so I think this is the time for him to go, and I think Michigan is planning for him to depart as well.
Well, Aaron, since the Ohio State game, fans and critics and experts all over the country in college football have weighed in on what has to change if Michigan is going to make that next step from being a very good team to an elite team, a team that contends in the Big Ten, a team that contends for the college football playoffs. On offense, Aaron, what do you think needs to change to make that happen?
I think they're going to have to take another step of all in the offense. I think they made strides this year. We've talked about this all, going into this year about the changes that need to happen. I think you saw them to some degree. Harbaugh and the coaching staff, I think, diversified a little bit with the offensive playbook, and I think you can credit Shea Patterson with that a lot. His ability to scramble outside the pocket and kind of just, advance plays. It was something we didn't see out of the quarterback position last year. Him returning, I think, would go a long way with that. But the Ohio State game was kind of I scratched my head because you saw them almost revert back to what they did week one against Notre Dame or even last season. And there wasn't a whole lot of diversity there. It seemed like they're trying to pound the football on first and second down again. Didn't take a ton of shots down the field. I think they've got to take another step with the playbook offensively. Folks, defenses, I think, were picking up on that. You saw it at Ohio State. They were able to shut down the run game. And I don't know if that means bringing in another offensive mind for Jim Harbaugh to kind of take over the offense, because the thing with Harbaugh is he wants to control the offense. He wants to have a say in it. So I think it's going to be hard for him to give up control in that regard. But I think he needs to bring in someone that's going to kind of challenge his thinking a little bit. Obviously college football has changed. Michigan has changed a little bit, but I think it needs to change more. Otherwise, it's going to be a struggle for them. In big games against high quality opponents. You saw it this year against Notre Dame. You saw this against Ohio State. And they may continue if they don't further change on offense.
Well, as good as the defense was, there are some that feel it needs to be better, and I'm not sure what people expect Don Brown to do. But do you think any changes need to be made with the D as far as philosophy and schematics are concerned, Aaron?
I think there's some room for improvement there. The thing is, Michigan's defense has been so good for the last couple of years, statistically, and the eye test and everything else. But the one knock against them is showing up for those big games and those high-powered offenses. You saw them last year struggle against Penn State, and again this year against Ohio State. They gave up a lot of big plays, and the opposing offense has found a way to beat them, and Michigan really had no answer for it. Now, if that means maybe reverting a little bit more to a zone kind of based defense, I don't know. Brown is sounded in the past very steadfast. He's a heavy man press guy. That's kind of what he knows, and that's kind of how he recruits. So I don't know if that means a change of philosophy for him. Maybe Michigan bringing in another guy on defense to help, or maybe analyze it a little bit more or something. I don't know. We haven't spoken to Don Brown since the Ohio State game. I'm curious to see what his response is to that game, because I can remember, speaking to him earlier in the year and him, still thinking about that Penn State loss last year. So I suspect this Ohio State game is going to sink with him for a long time. Maybe it makes him step back and rethink of the way he approaches some of these bigger games. I don't know. But I think something is going to need to change. If Michigan wants to take that next step and be a Big Ten champion and compete for a national title, it's one thing to get away with playing a heavy man press coverage scheme against maybe lesser talented Big Ten teams and non-conference opponents, but you've got to be able to adapt to some of the more high-powered offenses you play. And we've seen now twice in 2 years now where they've been gashed by a very good offense.
Well, the dust has not settled yet on the current season. We, of course, have the Peach Bowl to play, and I think we need some more time to gain perspective on the season that has just ended so that we can answer this question. Do you think Michigan is really that far away from being an elite program again?
I don't think so. And you saw, signs of that this year. I thought they were a very good team. Were they great? No. And it was the same thing 2 years ago in 2016. I thought they were a very good team. And I think you saw that after the fact with the number of the guys that went to the NFL. They had a lot of talent on this team. I think you're in a year or two now, you're going to look back at this year and say something similar. They have a lot of talent on this team. They've still done a very good job of recruiting. It's just winning that big game and getting them kind of over the hump. And I think really it's Ohio State. That's been the kind of a thorn in Michigan's side for a long time now. They've been a thorn in Jim Harbaugh's side for a long time. Because if you go back and think about it, they beat Ohio State this year. They get in the Big Ten title game and probably get in the playoff. It would have been a similar thing in 2016 as well. So it really comes down to that one game at the end of the year. Michigan showed them they could run the gall in the Big Ten this year. They beat some of the better teams. I think they played with Notre Dame week one. So I think they were right there. But that Ohio State game came back to bite them. They didn't play very well. You saw a difference, in the state of the programs. If they can beat Ohio State, I think that's the difference right now between Michigan getting over the hump and staying a good team.
Well, I've had a few weeks to think about that Ohio State game, Aaron, and as hard as it is for me, I think Michigan fans to admit, Dwayne Haskins is a great player. And yes, they have an abundance of speed at wide receiver positions, but to me, he was the reason Michigan got torched. He is that good, isn't he, Aaron?
Oh, yes. I was impressed with him. I was going over the numbers going in the game. I'd watched a little tape with him, obviously, and you see him against, some of the other Big Ten teams. But to see him do it against Michigan's defense, the number one ranked defense in the country, number one ranked passing defense in the country, I think speaks to his talent, his ability. He's not only does it with his arm, but he's able to do it with his legs, and he's able to create things. And he's, I think, the kind of type of quarterback, and I think Jim Harbaugh wished he had. He's that type of athlete. He's a Heisman Trophy finalist. He gets other guys involved. It's that Ohio State offense was impressive to watch, and obviously he's kind of the engine that made it run. And kudos to Urban Meyer and that staff there for recruiting him and developing him so quickly. People forget he's still a young guy. I mean, he's going to be very good. So keep an eye on him. But yeah, he was a difference maker on Saturday.
Well, we might not see him next year. I know at the Urban Meyer announcement, there was speculation this morning before we started taping that he might be gone too. So that might be something else that helps Michigan out next year.
Definitely. They need, at this point, Michigan need all the help they can get playing Ohio State.
Well, final thought, Aaron. In August, most of us had this Michigan team at 10-2 or 9-3. So in that sense, they met expectations, and of course, expectations changed during the season, but we still have the bowl game. Was this season a success, or because of the way it ended, a setback for Jim Harbaugh and his program?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I've reminded people, the last week or so of that. And you're absolutely right. Coming into this year, I had Michigan winning 9 games. I think some folks, best case scenario had them winning 10 games. So I think they're right there. But you're right. That's the thing with seasons. When you start, beating teams that folks weren't sure you're able to beat, expectations begin to rise. And then if you're able to meet those, you exceed the expectations, then it becomes a disappointment. So I think when you step back and look at this season, 10-2 wasn't bad. I think it was a success. They beat Michigan State. That was another question mark going into the year. The Penn State game was a question mark. Wisconsin was a question mark, and maybe those teams weren't as good as maybe some of us thought. But Michigan still won the game, and that's at the end of the day, that's the goal, to win football games. And Michigan won 10 of them this year. They lost to a playoff team. They lost to a team that was right outside the cusp of the playoffs, a team they struggled with all the last decade or 2 decades. So it was a successful season, but like you said, as the season goes on, expectations rise, and I think folks were cautiously optimistic that this team may be able to get over the hump finally and get in the Big Ten title game and playoff, and they weren't able to do that. So I think the expectations, but they fell just short of a dream-like scenario. And they'll try again next year. They've got a lot of guys coming back on both sides of the ball. I think there's a lot to like about this team going into next year. A lot of loose ends still to tie up, but I think they'll have an opportunity to be competitive again in Big Ten East next year.
Well, with us this morning or this week on our Game Day segment has been Aaron McMann, who does a wonderful job covering Michigan football for MLive, and of course It's not over yet. We have the bowl game to get ready for, and then in January, of course, we wrap things up for the current season. So, Aaron, thank you as always for your time during the season and the coming weeks and into the new year. We hope to have you back and wrap this thing up.
Always, Mike. Love to do it.
Quick Hits is next as we wrap it up for another week here on The Michigan Man on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. On Quick Hits today, Michigan Hoops is off to a 9-0 start, is ranked number 5 in the polls, which we know don't mean a thing in December. We still have a few weeks before our bowl preview shows get underway, so in the meantime, we are going to talk some Michigan hoops next week. I hope to have beat writer James Hawkins from the Detroit News on next week's show, so make sure you join us. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm on vacation this week, so we're going to keep it short. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Until next time, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!